Today on Switch to Linux, I want to ask, what is going on with Ubuntu? Why is it becoming not as good of a distro as it once was? We'll talk a little bit about this and some of the current things that I've seen coming on. Thanks for checking out this video by Switch to Linux. If you like this type of content, subscribe to the channel if you've not already done so. Leave us a like and a comment down below. You know, as we look at Linux, many of us first tried out Linux on Ubuntu. Now, if you're fairly new to Linux, you probably didn't. But, you know, 10, 15, 20 years ago, Ubuntu was one of your main go-to Linux distributions. A lot of this owed to the fact that it was one of the first distributions to really work really well on a wider variety of software. But they made some decisions that I think just weren't particularly good. My channel started around 2016 when 1604 was just in the process of coming out. In fact, I remember downloading and running a 1604 beta, and I didn't even know it was not a full release. It was so stable. It worked so well. I had no problems with it, and it really brought life back to my computer at a time that I decided I did not want to make a switch to Windows 10. It just wasn't happening. With what they were doing, the data they wanted to collect, the fact I couldn't turn it off, it was a no-brainer for me to just stop using Windows. I didn't like the Mac interface. Now, at that time, I was running Windows and I was running Mac, and I threw a Linux machine into the mix in there as well to test that out. And it worked out well. But I started to see some of the things that they were doing in the next versions. I think they were starting with the 1704, where they were trying to get convergence. And if you remember about a decade ago, convergence was the big thing. You know, that's one desktop system that could work for the computer, for the tablet, for the phone. This was the latest push. And I looked down as a brand new content creator, not even over 100 subscribers yet. And I looked at what they were doing with Unity 8, and I said, they're never going to make this work. And I did at that time a controversial video saying, this is not going to work. And lo and behold, not even a month or two later, they decided to drop Unity altogether and go back to GNOME. Giving my channel, maybe that was one of the things that caused my channel to jump up. That really was that video that really brought us from that 100 subscriber mark, carrying us up into only a couple months later, that 1,000 subscriber mark. Talking about what they were doing with that. And then, of course, they started introducing snaps and Snapcraft. And again, I called out and said, yeah, this is a problem. They're actually going to start replacing software. You go in to install something on their app, it's not going to install an app software. It's Foss even did an article about how I'm spreading fear, uncertainty, and doubt, which that article, by the way, is now taken down from its Foss. And I still have a great respect for its Foss. If you watch this channel enough, you know I cover them a lot. I do read their headlines as they come out. I interact a lot with their X account as I'm over there doing things on X. But at that time, they basically accused me of spreading FUD, you know, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It was a huge viral video. Still one of the top 10 videos I think that I actually had. And at that time, the community relations person for Snapcraft was Alan Pope, who's calling me out because he's doing his job, calling me out and trying to paint Snap in the best way, when I'm saying, hey, I think this is a problem. And wouldn't you know it, only about a year later, they started replacing the apt version of Firefox installed the Snap version. In fact, a lot of people still don't know this. A friend of mine who even works in computers but isn't a full-fledged Linux guy like I am, he actually texted me not long ago, like, hey, I went to install, like, I removed Firefox and went into the terminal and I did apt install Firefox. And I said, yeah, that still gives you the same Snap version you just had. He's like, no, I did it through the terminal. I said, no, it doesn't. Look at the source code for the apt application in Ubuntu. And he did that. And like, oh, I didn't know this. Yeah, so of course it started with Firefox and then Thunderbird. I think Thunderbird did. I know Chromium followed that path as well. And so now several packages are starting to give you Snap versions even if you use apt to install it on the terminal. They're basically writing a wrapper in an apt application which will install the Snap. And then for a while it became almost unmanageable to use anything other than Snap on Ubuntu. You still could. You could go into the terminal, but they switched to the Snap Store, and the Snap Store did not allow you to manage deb files or even basic repository software. And now you can use that. But actually, one of the first articles that just recently came out I wanted to talk about here is now they have entire articles about how Ubuntu's App Center now lets you manage deb packages. What? Ubuntu is based on Debian. Deb packages have been part of it ever since the beginning. And now they're just coming out with a video saying, hey, you can now manage deb packages. What have you been doing? And that's kind of the point that I wanted to ask. As we start looking at the things that Ubuntu is doing, sometimes they just don't make as much sense anymore. And this is why we're seeing Ubuntu dropping further and further on interested lists. You still have a lot of people still using it. It's still, if you go and do a quick search for Linux distributions on any search engine, they still generally, most people are still Ubuntu because, you know, a lot of those are just regurgitating the old things, and they're not keeping up with the fact that, you know, when I first started using Linux, Ubuntu was amazing and Fedora was impossible to use. You had to follow a guide of literally, there were websites 10 years ago, 20 steps to do after you install Fedora. Okay, and that got the system mostly working. Ubuntu worked out of the box. It was revolutionary. But then now the development in the last decade has gotten so good that nearly everything works out of the box, which is why if I download a new distro and it doesn't work for me out of the box, I don't spend a lot of time with it because there's so many other distros that have been well tested that Linux is easy. Now, we're starting to see some regressions. Call it hate if you want, but Wayland is a regression. A lot of features don't work as well. A lot of features don't work at all. Things that we wanted to get working, that we finally got working under Wayland, now they stopped. Now, that has been getting better and better and better. I'm not calling a hate and an end to Wayland. I'm saying distros need to stop dropping X because Wayland is 90% there. Because I remember Linux when X was 90% there, and it caused a serious problem. But Ubuntu, of course, is one of the ones leading the charge. The latest version is going to ship with GNOME 50, which drops X entirely from the code base. Now, I actually thought this would make the distribution smaller. When I first downloaded my first Linux distro, I think it was either 2 or 3 gigabytes to download. It is now up to 6 gigabytes of data to download the latest beta. That is crazy. And that's not the only thing that is happening here. It turns out that they're also in the process raising the minimum system requirements. It is now takes more system requirements to run Ubuntu than it does to run Windows 11. Why? What is going on with Ubuntu? Quietly raises its minimum system requirements. So in 2012, it required, let's see, here's your RAM, 384 megabytes for 32-bit systems, 512 megabytes for 64-bit systems, 1 gigahertz CPU, and 5 gigabytes of disk space. In 1404, 2 years before I switched to Linux regularly, they jumped that up 1 gigabyte of RAM, 1 gig processor, and 5 gigs of disk space. No real change over there. 2018, they raised it to 4 gigs of RAM. Then they raised the processor, 2 gigahertz dual core 64-bit processor, 25 gigabytes of disk space. Now, prior to this, we were doing a lot of our tests in 20 gigs of disk space. We had to bump that up. So now the latest release, 2604, now requires 6 gigs of RAM, which is very interesting because GNOME systems tend to feel a little heavy. You install the system, you boot it up, and they tend to run a little heavy. Not entirely, but a lot of it's just kind of what's going on. So is Ubuntu 2604 more RAM hungry? They basically, so not really, but they want to do this, not because it requires 2 gigabytes more memory, but more the way we compute it does, is what they say. The memory requirements better reflect real-world multitasking. So, yeah, you could install it with less than that, is what they're saying, but they're basically adding 2 gigabytes to the so that a person using it feels like it's a little better. Is this justified? Is this not? I don't know. So if you have a device with 4 gigabytes of RAM and can't extend it, there's alternatives, they say down here. This guy says he installed Ubuntu 26.04 on a laptop with just 2 gigabytes of memory, slow to the point of frustration in use, but otherwise functional. And that's an interesting point, and that's kind of what I wanted to get into. I wanted to have a look at that beta. Guess what? I can't seem to get it installed. I'm not sure why, but I can't seem to get it installed. I have tried real hardware. I tried virtualization. When you boot it up, it says, hey, there's an update to the installer. I've tried it with that update, without that update. The only thing I didn't try is multiple different computers, because I have one computer that allows me to install things. This is a Ryzen 5 1600 computer with 32 gigs of RAM, 4 gigabyte graphics card, and there's nothing in the system requirement says it can't run on that. Maybe there's a limitation. Am I running into a problem that it needs a TPM 2.0 chip? I don't know. In fact, this is the screen I get stuck on every single place. In real hardware and in virtualization, I tried to install it multiple different times. That's the screen. If you can make sense of that, let me know what the problem is. Let me know. Now, I didn't try doing a lot of deep customization in the install, but I ran through with the basic defaults. Boom, 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 boom. Just basically click next, 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 next through to get the system that I want. It always seems to crash out at the exact spot. And that is an interesting thing, because I really wanted to have a look at this release and see what it's like. But guess what? I can't seem to install it on my system, whether that's real hardware or whether that is a virtualization system. I tried GNOME boxes. I didn't try going into VirtualBox yet. Maybe I'll try that to see what we can do. But that's kind of interesting. But that's not really the only controversial thing we're talking about. We also talked a little bit about this. Ubuntu 26.10 could drop ButterFS, ZFS, and Lux support from Grub. Now, I did a whole video on this. This is not as big of a deal as it sounds, and it's also not something that they're full-fledged discussing. We're talking about it. It is something a developer is recommending and they are having a conversation about. But this also further cuts back a lot of the core functionality, reduces the system away from the way you might want to use your system, all while increasing the RAM and limiting you into certain types of software, being Snap software. And that is really an interesting point that I kind of wanted to make. What is going on with Ubuntu? Why is it a decade ago, 1604, I was able to download an alpha or beta, it was either an alpha or beta, I can't remember what it was, version of Ubuntu. I ran it, I didn't even know it was a testing software because it was so good. It was so stable. It worked so well. It was so well documented. And now we have this monstrosity nonsense. It fails to install, needs a lot more memory, limits your packages. What is going on? And maybe that really is the core reason why Ubuntu is starting to drop off of the list of requirements among people who are actually paying attention to trends. Unfortunately, more people still go to an AI or a search engine and say, what's the best Linux distro? And the first thing it spits out is Ubuntu! It's got to be Ubuntu! Because they're still reading the SEO of the internet that is well past the age of expiration. I mean, a lot of these sites on the internet stay around. In fact, if you go look up things in Ubuntu, help documents in Ubuntu, it's not uncommon to find many of the help resources were from Ubuntu 8, Ubuntu 10, Ubuntu 12. That was very common to see those things. And up until very recently, most of those guides worked really, really well. I think some of them still do. Some of them are starting to get a little bit out of date, but a lot of those things are still there. And including many, many, many articles written over the past 20 years praising Ubuntu as an amazing distribution. And now the AI just grabs all those up and spits out Ubuntu as the first choice. So more and more people are going to still continue to download Ubuntu as their first distro and have these problems and say, Linux just sucks. That's a problem. We need to start pushing other distros, which are a lot better, not just on our simple level here as YouTube content creators focusing on the Linux and FOSS software, but people writing articles. We need to start focusing on other distributions. Let's let Ubuntu do the things Ubuntu is going to do and let it fall off into obscurity. That would be the best path. And I don't want that to happen. I would love Ubuntu to maintain. It's just when an experienced guy like me can't even get it installed, what's going on over there? When you're talking about removing encryption support on bootloaders and increasing the RAM, and hey, we can now manage deb packages despite we're the biggest Debian-based distribution ever. What is going on over there? Let me know your thoughts about all these in the comments down below.